Hi, good morning. So my name is Patrick Kua. That's my Twitter handle, Pat Kua, if you'd like to ask me questions. And today I want to talk to you about the idea of the constant life of a tech lead. I work for a consulting company called ThoughtWorks based here in London. You might know some of our work from some of our luminaries, Martin Fowler and Jim Highsmith, who also happen to be Agile Manifesto signatories. And perhaps you know some of our ideas about continuous delivery and the lean enterprise. Maybe you've even read our tech radar, which is our view of what we're seeing with our clients around the world today. Now, for ThoughtWorks, I work as a principal technical consultant. And what this typically means is I play a variety of roles. Sometimes I'm writing code as a developer. Often I'm leading development teams and trying to build up that capability. And sometimes I'm working along CTOs around helping them build their organizations and develop their technical leadership prowess. Now, one of my personal interests is really about this idea about building the next generation of technical leaders. Over the past several years, I've been running a 2-day course, which is actually aimed at tech leads, transitioning from this role of being a developer into the tech lead, and hearing about all the constant hopes, concerns, and challenges that you will face in this particular role. And what's quite interesting is I've run this a number of times around the world, and what I hear is a constant stream of the same ideas, regardless of the domain people tend to be working in, regardless of the size or the type of the company that they're working in, and regardless of which country they also happen to be working in. And during this talk, what I hope to share with you are some of those constants, and maybe some strategies and techniques for how you might actually deal with them. Now, as a developer, you probably know this. There are a whole bunch of things you get used to over time. So like solving problems through writing code. We get that thrill, that buzz out of seeing our sort of software work and seeing end users actually get value out of the things that we build. Perhaps you're doing TDD and you're used to the constant of this red-green cycle, where red is telling us about this idea of our code not performing to what we hope it to do. And we get that constant buzz when we see that green bar and we know that we've done enough to get our test to pass. Perhaps you're working in some form of continuous delivery, where you have the constant beat of continuous integration builds, sometimes broken, we have to fix that, and perhaps you're constantly releasing these builds even into production. And like most companies that we sort of consult for, you're probably working in some sort of agile sort of fashion, where it's quite a regular event where you're showcasing your software to people, and you often hear this feedback from stakeholders and users, it's not really what I want. Can you make a little bit of a change? I guess over time, as a developer, one of the things you learn are these sets of constants that you actually deal with, the normal expectations and patterns, and you develop strategies for actually handling it. Now, over time, you'll probably end up with a lot of experience, and you'll suddenly be asked by someone perhaps to take on the role of this tech lead, and you sort of ask yourself, well, now that I'm doing this role, what's expected of me? You find yourself in different situations, and you're not quite sure, is this a normal thing that I have to deal with? How do I actually deal with some of these things? But over time, as you gain more experiences with different teams, perhaps with the same team, you learn different experiences and strategies of actually dealing with them. So the 3 areas I'd like to cover about these constants are really this idea about tech, people, and the system. We'll go through each one by one. So we wouldn't be much of a tech lead if we didn't actually think about the tech. And maybe one of the things that is a constant that we're quite well aware of is really thinking about this idea that tech will change. We know this as developers. It's one of the things that we probably struggle with in this role of being a leader, in that we don't often have not enough time to keep up with the pace of change. Now, I think it's really interesting if I look back over maybe my time in the industry around thinking about what are the environments of what we've been writing code in. Now, every programming language will often have a whole ecosystem of libraries, tools, frameworks, and it's quite interesting even just simply looking at those core programming languages about how much change there's been. So we'll have things like Python, JavaScript, PHP, Ruby and Java, C#, Scala, Clojure, Go, Swift, and Kotlin. And I guess what's interesting about this is that we're all in a frenzy of always trying to keep up to date with the latest technologies, But what this tells us, a brief look at our history, is that these things will continue to change. These things will not be the last things that will appear on our horizon. And we won't be able to predict what will actually happen in the future, but we can be certain that there will be new things that we'll have to learn. So how do we deal with this constant pace of change? And what do we use as our strategies as tech leads where we have other responsibilities to deal with? So one of the reasons we often want to use new tools in programming is really thinking about the value that we derive. We look for higher order things that help us solve problems better. Now, when we first use a tool, we'll probably make a lot of mistakes. And therefore, we also, as we use something, we'll learn how to use it and apply it and get a lot more value out of those particular tools. As we gain more experience, we can actually translate that experience to how we use these tools. And that's often a thing that we often hire people for. We don't have this knowledge about a particular platform or tool. Maybe we need somebody with that experience. There's another lever that we can actually pull, particularly in this role of a tech lead. And this is really about the idea about principles. And what I've found over my career is actually these principles are the things that help us understand if we're dealing with a new tool, how do we actually then apply it to our problem that we're actually having? More than that, principles can also help us shape our experiences, and we can reuse our experiences with our new tools to get even more value out of the things that we are trying to learn. So these are the things that I would encourage you to really focus on in terms of really understanding and leveraging your knowledge about principles, and also helping grow people and teach them about the principles as well. So principles are the things that will outlast tools, and these are the things that you should sort of focus on. So what's a concrete example? Well, we always have some sort of code when we're actually building systems. And regardless of what programming language that we're working in, regardless of what tools, you're probably going to ask yourself, how do I know the code is good? We're often asking ourselves, is this code better or worse? Regardless of what programming language you happen to be using, we know, for instance, that methods that are 300 lines long are a lot worse than shorter methods that are a bit more understandable. We know that methods that have names such as does something isn't as explicit as a well-named method. And these are things that we can actually transcend and use across different languages. So the principles of code smells that we'll talk a little bit about, and understanding how you actually understand what good code looks like. Now, maybe a really relevant principle to a lot of you out here is actually this idea of principle of information hiding. Now, if people are familiar with this, you probably know that it comes from this paper, which is called On the Criteria to be Used in Decomposing Systems into Modules. Now, what's kind of interesting about this paper is what happens if we strike out this word modules and we replace it with the word services? Bit buzzword friendly, microservices, right? So how do we actually look at decomposing systems into microservices? And suddenly there's an interesting paper that's highly relevant to the things that we might be building and developing today. Now, this paper talks about how modularization is a mechanism for improving the flexibility and comprehensibility of a system while allowing the shortening of its development time. And that's exactly what we hear with a lot of people wanting to move towards microservices. We need to deliver things faster, we want to make changes easier, and we want to modularize our large application into smaller things so that we can improve the rate of change. Now, what's interesting in this paper is that they talk about not just modularization, but really about how to go about modularizing. And so they talk about the effectiveness of modularization is dependent upon the criteria used in dividing the system into modules. Now, what this means is you can't just slice a system any way that you'd like. How you slice a system will dictate whether or not you'll get the benefits of the flexibility that you want. Now, I won't spoil the paper for you, and I suggest you read it. The point behind this is that this paper has been around for an interestingly long time, and we have a lot of things that we can actually learn from it. So the question is, well, when was this paper actually published? I'll give you a hint. It's older than I am. And I'm not as young as I probably look. 1972 is when the paper was written. So you can probably think that's probably older than most of you in this room, and yet it's still highly relevant to the things that we're building today. Even if not building microservices, you can still benefit from proper modularization, even in other languages that you have. So another principle of code smells that we talked about earlier can be addressed through the ideas of refactoring. And Martin Fowler's book on refactoring helps us understand what code smells there are and how you might actually mitigate some of those. And I guess what's interesting about this book is that it's also kind of old. You can kind of tell from the cover. And this is more than 20 years old, right? And it's really interesting because these concepts still are relevant regardless of what new programming language you'll adopt in the future. And you can still apply these refactorings to get the value out of it. And interestingly, the concept is actually a lot older than the book, which is 30 years old when it first appeared in a particular paper. So ask yourself, when you're going through busy trying to gain experience with new tools, what can I learn which I can use in a different context or with a different tool? Don't focus simply on just trying to get the most experience with the latest and greatest tools. Understand the principles that you have, because these things will outlast the actual tools themselves. These things are the things that you can actually take in any environment and get a lot more value out of. Now, there is one warning to this, and this is really that you still need to apply principles into practice. And so I often talk about how tech leads should still spend some time with the code. I expect that you can at least read and perhaps contribute to the code, because you still need to understand how the principles apply in the context of the problem that you're having. You need to empathize with the challenges that developers will have, and also make sure that you give the right amount of guidance. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be the best at remembering all the APIs, or remember the exact syntax as you're typing it in. The point is that you have a lot more value you can add and contribute to the team if you're focused on the principles behind them. So we've kind of focused on tech, which is hopefully not so unfamiliar for you. But one of the interesting areas is really about this idea about people. And on my journey of helping a lot of people become new tech leads, it's an interesting area where a lot of organizations don't give people support. You know, you're maybe the most senior developer, the most experienced. Suddenly you have to lead a team, and nobody has equipped you with skills or experience on how to do that. And that's where I want to talk about some of the constants that I see. Now, interestingly, one of the times that, well, over the time of my career, I've dealt with lots of organizations, lots of teams, and lots of different environments. So I've worked with lots of different people. And one of the interesting things I've learned over this is in this statement. What did you fill in there? What was your mental model? Hold that thought and we'll come back to it. Over time, I've learned that people are unique. They're individual, and they're different. Now, when you first step into the role of a tech lead, it's probably easy to sort of think about all developers approaching problems exactly how you would approach those problems. It's easy to sort of think about everyone being the same as you. And if there's any advice I would give you is to really invest in reading about how people really do differ. And I want to share with you 3 different perspectives of how you might look at people through different lenses to appreciate how people really differ. One of my favorites is actually from this book called StrengthsFinder. So it's written by Tom Rath. He works for an organization called Gallup, and they did 1.7 million interviews with people around the world in all organizations. And they sort of try to focus on what makes people successful in the roles that they do, and why are they so successful. And they came up with about 34 signature strengths, and noticed that people who are really successful focused on applying their strengths in the role and context of what they're having, rather than just focusing on the weaknesses. Now, you still need to look at weaknesses, but it's not necessarily that you will get amazingly good just by focusing on weaknesses, and you're better off by focusing on your strengths. Now, if you read this book, there's an online survey that you take, and you end up with top 5 signature strengths that talk about maybe what are the things that you find you always focus on, and the things that you seem to use in whichever role or perspective that you're playing in life. So as an example, one of my strengths when I did this was actually this idea about achiever. So for me, there's this idea in whatever role that I'm having, I need to have a sense of progress, a sense of achievement each time that I'm actually moving towards something. There's another strength which is really about strategic. It's apparently a rare strength, where people are often not thinking about what you're doing now, but they're thinking about the implications about what that means in the future. And that's a really interesting strength to have. Now, I won't go through all the different strengths because there's the book for that. But what's interesting is when you have your top 5 signature strengths, other people will have different strengths from you. And as a result, that means that you can complement each other. You don't necessarily need to be good at those strengths because you have other people who have different strengths from you, but you need people who have different strengths and not just the same ones as you. Now, another perspective that is often valuable, particularly for any of you working in distributed teams, is this idea of Hofstede's cultural dimensions. So Hofstede's a researcher that's really been focused on trying to understand differences in cross-cultural communications. So people across different countries and how they maybe differ. Now, the original model had 4, and they've kind of evolved it into 6 now. And it's really talking about how nations have different perspectives around how they maybe approach problems or how they think as a society. So one of the most favorite ones that I like to talk about is really about this idea of power distance index. And this is really about the perception of people maybe lower in a hierarchy and how strong they perceive power in a hierarchy of some sorts. Now, if any of you have done any work in, say, France is a country that has a generally high power distance index. And it's quite interesting when you talk to developers working in organizations, because they'll often simply agree with what their manager says, even if it's the incorrect solution, because of this cultural dimension of a high power distance index. And that's quite different from, say, here in the UK or in the US, where it's okay to challenge your manager. And if you're playing that person and you're leading that role and you're not getting that challenge from maybe somebody else, it might be a different reason for that. It's not necessarily about you or them. It might be about cultural dimensions. Another really good example around this is this idea about uncertainty avoidance. So in Singapore, where I ran a course earlier this year, they have a very low uncertainty avoidance. And it was really interesting because I was talking to people about this. And they even have this word for it. I'm probably going to pronounce it incorrectly, but ching chai is this idea which translates to flexible. So things can always be undone. Decisions can always be reversed. And that's quite interesting if you're working with people, say, from Germany or Greece, where there's a high uncertainty avoidance, where it's very important to make decisions very early to avoid uncertainty, or at least a feeling of uncertainty. So the third model I want to talk to you about really comes from Simon Wardley. You might be familiar with his Wardley maps. And he talks about how there are 3 groups of people in organizations that he sees. You have the pioneers, who are the people wanting to start new things. They get excited, but they get really bored very quickly because they want to move on to another new thing straight away. You have settlers who are really good at taking those ideas, growing them, amplifying them, and trying to make the most of testing out the market. And then you have the town planners. They're the people who like stable processes. They like to be metric-driven. They like to measure things, and they seek operational efficiency. And that's maybe another perspective about preference about how people would like to work, and maybe where they can apply their strengths in different perspectives. So these models will help us understand our different elements. And what's really interesting about this is when we actually go back to our team, we can apply these perspectives to our team, and then we can see people differently. We can appreciate each person's unique skills, their background, their strengths, their hopes, their fears, what they bring, and what they need help with. And as a reason, because you have so much diversity in your team is a lot stronger as a result. It's a lot more resilient. And so, at least in my sort of personal experience, what I've found is teams of very diverse groups will be a lot stronger. And from diversity comes strength. But there is a caveat, and this is really your role here as leaders. It's only if you allow it. It's only if you nurture it and encourage everyone to bring their full self into their environment. And what I'm really glad is there's a couple of talks tomorrow, Jill Wetzler and Matthias Meyer, talking about inclusion and how you can achieve that. So really look forward to that tomorrow. And there is one more warning around this, and this is really around thinking about archetypes, not stereotypes. As you go on your journey about understanding people, you might start to box people into expected behaviors. Archetypes are simply patterns that might help you think about things differently, but everyone is an individual. You can't apply these and expect people to behave according to those stereotypes. Now, the other topic about people is really thinking about you and how you approach problems. Now, as a developer, one of the modes that you'll be in is this idea of maker mode. You will see yourself as a maker. And the challenge for you moving into this role of a tech lead is moving away from this mentality of building things and making things and focusing on being a multiplier. And this is where really what you're really looking for is thinking about how you multiply the effectiveness of your team. So as a developer, one of the habits that you'll probably get used to is I have success when I know I've written my features and it's in production being used by people. However, when you play this role, the amount of code you write will be significantly less. You can't measure yourself through success through the code that you personally write. Instead, one of the things you really care about is the quality and the output from the team and what they produce. And the best way that you can do that is by giving people power-ups, helping multiply their effectiveness. Are you building capabilities in the team of the things that you don't have within the team? Are you ensuring that people have timely, useful feedback? And we'll hear from Erica Carlson later today about how you might effectively do this. Are you ensuring that knowledge is evenly distributed to prevent bottlenecks so the team can continue producing quality output as you go? And are you ensuring that everyone can bring their uniqueness and apply their strengths to areas that they're interested in so that people are individually fulfilled? So we talked about people, and I'd like to talk about system. And this is really the idea that there are some constants in the system, and one of them is that time is a constant. And one interesting thing about that is there will never be enough time. Now, any of you in this role will probably understand time management's such a key problem to deal with. You'll have endless emails that you feel you'll need to respond to. You know that your to-do list is ever growing, and you keep adding things to it, and never seems to end. And you're certainly trying to avoid or minimize the number of meetings that you actually have. So how do you go about managing the system and the time constant? Well, my favorite tool around this is this thing called the Eisenhower matrix. And this is thinking about all the particular activities that you do and trying to classify them in a couple of different dimensions. So you might think about these things about being urgent or less urgent, and things being important and less important. Now, one of the challenges of maintaining a single to-do list is that everything is important, not necessarily prioritized, and you kind of end up going through your list. So it kind of makes sense to go through your list of to-dos, activities, and try to work out where you're actually spending time. And this matrix will help you prioritize what you actually do about them. So for those things that are important and urgent, you definitely need to take action. There's a production outage. There's a crisis. We have to do something about that. We can't sit around and think about it. Maybe somebody quit. You have to have a discussion about why that is, what happened, what could we do to prevent that. These are things that you need to act on relatively quickly. I would say in my experience, there shouldn't be many of these on a day-to-day basis. There are some things that are less urgent and definitely not important. Do you need to get involved in every technical discussion just because you have an opinion about something, even though it may not be so important? Do you need to check your emails 20 times a day because those emails will still be there later that day to respond to? Try to minimize the amount of activity that you do, and you'll save yourself a little bit more time. Now, for the things that are urgent and maybe less important, get other people involved in it. If you don't have people who you can delegate to, what you should be doing is looking at growing people into that role, where you might be coaching and mentoring people so you can delegate things to that person. Perhaps you're the person that instigates code reviews all the time as a team. Maybe somebody else in the team can actually take care of that. But maybe they need help in actually knowing how to run a code review session with the entire group. Maybe you're the person that set up your CI server, and you have fun in actually administering that CI server all the time. But maybe you shouldn't actually be doing that, and maybe somebody else can actually help administer the server, and you can grow somebody in that. The point about this is that you should be trying to minimize the things that other people can actually do that you personally don't necessarily need to get involved in. Now, the quadrant that I've left last is the one that I find people struggle the most with, and this is often the less urgent and the important. These are the things that nobody will ever ask you to do. Nobody will ever ask you, how do we break up a big technical problem into smaller chunks so we can incrementally deal with one large technical debt? Nobody's going to ask you to necessarily set the technical vision for people to know where they're actually heading, but it's extremely important, but not necessarily urgent. Nobody's going to ask you to necessarily build relationships with people outside of your team so you can have better relationships with operations, infrastructure, or people in marketing or product. These are things you really need to make sure that you spend time in, and you need to decide to make the time. You need to carve out time in your schedule to make sure you deal with some of these examples. And Eisenhower is kind of attributed to this because he talks about how what is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. So it's easy to get caught in this loop of reacting to things and making sure that you really prioritize time to deal with those things that are important but not necessarily urgent. Now, one of the reasons that you fall into this trap is often this lack of double loop learning, and I want to talk briefly about this idea, about how you might use it as a system tool to think about how you manage time. Now, in normal everyday life, we kind of expect to do something. We want to take action on something. So we think about something, we do something, and we're hoping to have a positive impact with that and expect a particular result. And if you're doing retrospectives, if you're reflecting over different what observations there are, you might take different actions because you didn't get the results that you actually expect. But this is only single loop learning. And what's really interesting about single loop learning is that it's limited. You'll always end up with the same types of actions. But maybe you're not getting the results of the effect that you kind of actually want. Now, one of the reasons that you end up taking actions is really this idea of mental models. So mental models are the things that drive your actions. And what's interesting about double loop learning is not only reflecting over what you're seeing in the environment, but also reflecting over what you were thinking and what your state of play is. Perhaps you perceive people in a certain manner, and therefore you take a certain action because your belief is something about that person. And so double loop learning is really this idea about not necessarily just reflecting on what you're observing, but also reflecting on the mental process of what you're actually thinking. Perhaps you don't have enough time to actually think about this. And this is certainly one of those challenges where if you're constantly fighting fires, then you'll end up in this single loop learning all the time. So you'll never end up having time to say, maybe my mental model's not yet right, and I'm not seeing all the things that I could possibly see as a result, and therefore I'm taking the wrong sorts of actions. And one of the reasons I bring this up is really going back to the Eisenhower matrix and then talking about these things that are less urgent and important. Understanding what's going on in your head is a really critical thing to being successful and for you to implement double loop learning properly. Some of you might even benefit from having a coach. Some of you may already have a coach. And that might actually help you explore what's going on in your head. That might challenge some of the actions that you have. And if you've had a really good coaching experience, you can kind of understand what happens when somebody leads you to a point and they point something out that you don't really see in the way that you've been thinking, and that leads to a different result and a different action. So make sure that you decide to make time to deal with the things that are less urgent and important. So we've explored a number of different constants across the 3 different areas. We've talked about the challenges of tech is ever constantly changing and how a focus on principles will actually deal with that. We've talked about people and appreciating them for their differences. And we've talked about system and how to manage the constant of time. What I hope you do is really reflect on how you're approaching your role and maybe developing tools and strategies to help you deal with different constants over the life of your role as a tech lead. Thank you.